People think the Mafia's biggest threat was rival families. Wars, vendettas, bodies in the street. But every man on this list was killed by someone he trusted completely. A bodyguard, a driver, an underboss, a consigliere. Not a single enemy bullet between them. In this video, we break down 10 Mafia bosses who were executed by their most trusted men. Section 1. Big Jim Colosimo. Johnny Torrio arrived in Chicago in 1909 at his own boss's invitation. Big Jim Colosimo had built a criminal empire across the city's levee district, running over 100 brothels, paying off politicians, and dining with judges at his famous restaurant on South Wabash Avenue. When Black Hand extortionists began targeting him with threatening letters, he brought in his wife's nephew from New York to handle it. Torrio resolved the problem, settled into the organization, and rose to underboss. When Prohibition arrived in 1920, Torrio saw the opportunity immediately and pushed Colosimo hard to enter the bootlegging business. Colosimo refused. He had recently remarried a young singer named Dale Winter and had built a level of respectability he was unwilling to risk. For Torrio, the refusal was not something he was prepared to accept. He arranged for a New York hitman named Frankie Yale to travel to Chicago. Colosimo was lured to his own restaurant on May 11, 1920, with word of an arriving shipment that needed his attention. He walked in, found nothing waiting, and was shot once behind the right ear by a gunman in the cloakroom. He died on the floor of the same building he had built from nothing. He was 42 years old. Torrio stepped into control without obstacle, and within a few years brought in Al Capone. No one was ever charged. Colosimo's restaurant stayed open for decades after his death, run under the same name by other men. The next boss on this list also died at a meal, but his trusted lieutenant made sure to be in the bathroom when the shooting started. Section 2. Joe Masseria. On April 15, 1931, Joe Masseria sat down for lunch at a restaurant called Nuova Villa Tamaro on Coney Island. He was there with Lucky Luciano, his most trusted lieutenant, the man he had brought up through the ranks since 1920 and handed control of bootlegging, narcotics, and prostitution operations across the family's territory. Masseria was boss of what later became the Genovese crime family, known across New York simply as Joe the Boss, a title he enforced with heavy tributes and an iron grip on anyone operating in his territory. He and Luciano had eaten together dozens of times. There was nothing unusual about the afternoon. After lunch, they played cards. At some point, Luciano excused himself and walked to the bathroom. While he was gone, 4 gunmen entered the restaurant and shot Masseria multiple times. He died at the table. When police arrived, Luciano was the only man left in the room. He told investigators he had heard nothing from the bathroom and had no idea what happened. He was brought in for questioning and released without charges. What investigators did not know at the time was that Luciano had been secretly negotiating with Masseria's chief rival, Salvatore Maranzano, for months. The Castellano war between the two factions had been draining both sides since 1930, and Luciano had grown tired of it. He had also grown tired of Masseria's rigid insistence on working only with Sicilians, a rule that cut the family off from profitable alliances with Jewish and Irish operators. The deal Luciano struck with Maranzano was straightforward: deliver Masseria's death and receive peace, power, and a seat at the top of whatever came next. Masseria had trusted Luciano completely, had given him everything, and had no reason to believe the afternoon would end any differently than the dozens of lunches before it. Luciano simply waited for the right moment, stood up from the table, and walked away. The man Luciano handed power to lasted 5 months. What happened inside a Park Avenue office building that September would close out one of the bloodiest years in American Mafia history. Section 3. Salvatore Maranzano. Salvatore Maranzano walked out of the Castellano War as the most powerful man in American organized crime. With Masseria dead, he called a gathering of mob leaders in the Bronx, declared himself capo di tutti capi, boss of all bosses, and laid out the structure the American Mafia would follow for generations. 5 families, a clear chain of command, defined territories. He modeled the whole thing on Julius Caesar and the Roman Empire, kept a biography of Caesar on his desk, and saw himself as the man who had finally brought order to American gangland. He gave Lucky Luciano control of one of those 5 families and a share of everything Masseria had built. He had handed power to the man who would kill him. Within weeks, Maranzano had begun to sense that Luciano was too ambitious to remain beneath him. He drew up a list of men he wanted removed, with Luciano near the top, and arranged for an Irish hitman named Vincent Call to carry out the killings. Luciano and Genovese were summoned to Maranzano's office at 230 Park Avenue on September 10, 1931, under the pretense of a meeting. The plan was to kill them there. What Maranzano did not know was that one of his own men, Tommy Lucchese, had already warned Luciano. Luciano moved first. A team of gunmen entered the Park Avenue building dressed as Internal Revenue Service agents, disarmed Maranzano's guards, and cornered the boss in his 9th-floor office. He was stabbed 4 times and then shot. Vincent Call arrived for his scheduled meeting shortly after and found the office already cleared. Maranzano had been boss of all bosses for 5 months. Luciano scrapped the title entirely and replaced it with the Commission, a governing body where the major families shared power. No single man would hold that kind of authority again. No one was ever charged with Maranzano's murder. 2 bosses removed in the same year by the same man. The violence of 1931 set the rules the Mafia would live by, and die by, for decades to come. The next boss trusted his underboss for 20 years before that trust was used against him. Section 4. Vincent Mangano. Vincent Mangano had led his family since 1931, the same year Luciano restructured the entire American Mafia. He controlled the Brooklyn waterfront through deep ties to the Longshoremen's Union, ran gambling operations across the borough, and kept a low enough profile to survive 2 decades in one of the most dangerous positions in organized crime. His underboss for all of those 20 years was Albert Anastasia, a man who had earned his reputation as one of the most feared enforcers in the country, the former chief executioner of a crew known as Murder Incorporated. Anastasia had been placed in the family by Lucky Luciano and Frank Costello, men whose influence ran deeper than Mangano's own. That arrangement bred resentment from the start. Mangano resented the fact that Anastasia answered to outside bosses and operated as though the family were already his. Anastasia resented taking orders from a man he clearly felt was beneath him. The two had argued for years, sometimes violently enough that other men had to physically separate them. For 2 decades they coexisted inside the same organization, each man aware that the other was a threat. By early 1951, Mangano had begun making plans to have Anastasia killed. Anastasia found out and moved first. On April 19, 1951, Philip Mangano, Vincent's brother, and a senior figure in the family, was found shot 3 times in a wetland near Sheepshead Bay in Brooklyn. Vincent Mangano vanished the same day and was never seen again. His body was never recovered. A Brooklyn court declared him legally dead 10 years later. When Anastasia stood before the other family bosses to explain himself, he claimed Mangano had been plotting against him and that he had acted in self-defense. Frank Costello confirmed the account. The commission accepted it and handed Anastasia control of the family. He had stood at Mangano's side for 20 years, and every one of those years had been preparation for a single move. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 20 years of loyalty, concealing 20 years of patience. The man who replaced Mangano would himself be removed 6 years later, in a Manhattan barbershop, by the underboss sitting closest to him. Section 5. Albert Anastasia. Albert Anastasia ran the family he had taken from Vincent Mangano with the same volatility that had defined his entire career. He ordered murders impulsively, interfered in other families' business, and by 1957 had begun attempting to buy his way into the Cuban casino operations that Meyer Lansky had spent years carefully building. That move drew enemies from multiple directions at once. The man who acted on that resentment was sitting inside Anastasia's own organization, watching and waiting. Carlo Gambino had been Anastasia's underboss for years, a quieter and far more patient figure who had built a quiet coalition with Vito Genovese, the ambitious boss of another New York family. The arrangement was simple. Genovese wanted a clearer path to dominance over the commission, and Gambino wanted the family itself. On the morning of October 25, 1957, Anastasia was driven from his home to the Park Sheraton Hotel in Manhattan for his regular haircut. His bodyguard stepped outside on a brief errand, leaving him alone in the barber's chair. 2 masked gunmen entered from the hotel corridor, and opened fire, putting 10 shots into the boss. Anastasia lurched out of the chair in a daze and moved toward his attackers, but in his confusion he charged at their reflections in the mirror, rather than the men themselves. He fell to the floor and died there, still wrapped in the barber's cloth, a towel draped across his neck. The gunmen walked out of the hotel and disappeared into the city. Their identities were never confirmed. No charges were ever brought. Gambino took control of the family, which carried his name from that point forward, and ran it with the steady, low-profile precision that Anastasia had never been capable of. Genovese's reward was shorter-lived. Within 2 years, former allies including Gambino and Lansky had conspired to have him framed on drug charges. He died in federal prison in 1969. Anastasia had taken the family by removing his boss. Gambino took it by removing Anastasia. Each move followed the same logic, and the men who came next would follow the same pattern in different cities. Section 6. Sam Giancana. Sam Giancana had run the Chicago outfit through one of the most consequential periods in its history. During the late 1950s and early 1960s, his reach extended far beyond Chicago, into Las Vegas casinos, Havana gambling operations, and a reported collaboration with the CIA in plots to assassinate Fidel Castro after the Cuban Revolution shut the mob out of its most profitable Caribbean territory. His name surfaced in Senate investigations. The FBI placed him under surveillance so relentless and personal that agents would follow him onto golf courses and stand close enough to count his strokes. By 1966, that level of attention had made Giancana a liability to the organization he had built, and the men still running the outfit forced him out. He relocated to Mexico and stayed there for several years. He returned to Chicago in 1974. In 1975, a Senate committee investigating CIA activities summoned him to testify. Giancana had knowledge that reached deep into the outfit's most sensitive operations, information that the men still running the organization could not afford to have delivered under oath to a government panel. Tony Accardo, the longtime senior authority of the Chicago outfit who had preceded Giancana as boss and never fully relinquished his influence, is widely believed by federal investigators to have ordered the killing. The murder was never officially solved, and no charges were ever brought. On the evening of June 19, 1975, Giancana hosted a small gathering at his home in Oak Park, Illinois. The guests left around 11. Someone arrived afterward and was led inside without resistance, suggesting Giancana knew and trusted whoever came to his door that night. He was at the stove cooking sausage when he was shot once in the back of the head with a silenced pistol. He was then turned over and shot several more times in the face and neck. A murder weapon was recovered afterward from a forest preserve located between Giancana's home and Tony Accardo's residence. Giancana was scheduled to appear before the Senate committee the following morning. A man who had survived decades at the top of the most ruthless criminal organization in Chicago was undone not by a rival, but by the colleague who knew him best. The next boss never even made it through lunch. Section 7. Carmine Galante. Carmine Galante had seized control of the Bonanno family, while its official boss, Philip Rastelli, was sitting in prison and declared himself boss of all bosses of the New York underworld, a title no one had claimed since Maranzano, and one the other four families had no intention of honoring. He built a personal army of Sicilian immigrants who answered only to him, men he called his zips, and trusted them above everyone else in the organization. Two of them, Cesare Bonventre and Baldo Amato, served as his personal bodyguards. Galante was so confident in his own protection that he reportedly told associates no one would ever dare kill him. The commission had already decided otherwise. By 1979, all four other New York families had sanctioned his removal. What made the hit possible was that the men assigned to carry it out were already standing next to him. Bonventre and Amato were offered promotion and a larger share of the family's drug operations in exchange for their cooperation. They did not hesitate. On July 12, 1979, they accompanied Galante to lunch at Joe and Mary's restaurant on Knickerbocker Avenue in Brooklyn. At around 2:45 in the afternoon, 3 gunmen in ski masks entered and opened fire. Galante and 2 other men were killed instantly. Bonventre and Amato were unharmed, made no attempt to intervene, and walked away from the scene. Neither was ever charged. A photograph taken at the scene showed Galante face up on the patio with his cigar still clenched between his teeth. The men paid to take a bullet for their boss stepped aside and let the bullets through instead. The next boss on this list was shot in the back of the head by his own driver on a quiet street in South Philadelphia. Section 8. Angelo Bruno. Angelo Bruno had run the Philadelphia crime family since 1959, with a restraint that made him unusual among mob bosses of his era. He preferred negotiation over violence, kept the family operating quietly enough to avoid serious federal attention, and held his position for over 2 decades without internal challenge. His men called him the Gentle Don. His consigliere was Antonio Caponegro, known as Tony Bananas, one of the most senior and trusted figures in the organization. By the late 1970s, resentment had been building over Bruno's refusal to allow the family into the drug trade, a decision that was costing his men significant income. Caponegro had also convinced himself, without any basis in fact, that he had the backing of the Genovese family in New York for what he was planning. He had no such backing. He acted anyway. On the evening of March 21, 1980, Bruno dined at his regular restaurant in South Philadelphia and was driven home by a man named John Stanfa. Bruno sat in the passenger seat outside his row house on Snyder Avenue, smoking a cigarette. Stanfa gave a signal. A gunman approached from the passenger side, placed a shotgun behind Bruno's ear, and fired once. Bruno died in the seat. He was 69 years old. Caponegro's body was found 3 weeks later in the trunk of a car in the Bronx, naked and badly beaten, with torn bills forced into his mouth and on his person. The commission had not sanctioned the murder, and Caponegro paid for that with his life. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A boss killed by his consigliere, and a consigliere killed weeks later for doing it. Philadelphia was not finished. The man who replaced Bruno lasted less than a year before a bomb ended his reign on his own front porch. Section 9. Philip Testa. Philip Testa took over the Philadelphia family immediately after Angelo Bruno's murder in March 1980. He had been Bruno's underboss, a loyal figure in the organization for years, and his elevation to boss was straightforward. The commission endorsed it without dispute. Testa was old-fashioned in the way the senior men respected, deeply Catholic, disciplined, and serious about the way the family conducted itself. His men called him the Chicken Man, a nickname that came from his involvement in a legitimate poultry business he ran alongside his criminal operations. His underboss was a man named Peter Casella, a senior figure in the Philadelphia organization, who had stood close to the leadership for years, and who Testa had every reason to trust. What Testa did not know was that Casella had already begun building a conspiracy against him almost from the moment Testa assumed control. The specific grievances were rooted in money and power, disagreements over how the family should be run, and who should be profiting from it. Casella brought in Frank Narducci Sr., another senior figure in the organization, and together they made arrangements. On the night of March 15, 1981, Testa returned home to his row house at 2117 West Porter Street in South Philadelphia after an evening out. As he stepped onto his front porch and reached for the door, a nail bomb packed with roofing nails and explosives detonated beneath the porch. The blast was powerful enough that neighbors several blocks away reported hearing what they thought was a factory explosion. Pieces of the porch were scattered across the street. Testa was rushed to hospital but did not survive. He had been boss for less than 12 months. Casella attempted to claim leadership of the family in the aftermath, telling other members that the New York families had approved his taking over. They had not. The commission instead handed control to Nicky Scarfo, and Casella quietly disappeared from Philadelphia soon after. A boss removed by a bomb planted by the man who stood directly beneath him. What came next, in Midtown Manhattan on a December evening in 1985, was the most brazen mob killing in American history. Section 10. Paul Castellano. Paul Castellano had run the Gambino family since 1976, inheriting it from his cousin and brother-in-law Carlo Gambino, and had transformed it into the most powerful crime family in the country, by running it more like a corporation than a street gang. He preferred meetings in his Staten Island mansion to FaceTime with his capos, wore expensive suits, and involved the family in legitimate construction and meat businesses alongside its criminal operations. His men resented the distance. One of his capos, John Gotti, had built a loyal following in the streets of Queens and Brooklyn, and operated with an energy that was the opposite of Castellano's boardroom style. When FBI surveillance recordings made inside the mansion surfaced in 1985 and revealed Castellano speaking about his own men with open contempt, calling them animals, the resentment hardened into something else entirely. Gotti had also learned that Castellano was considering reorganizing the family in a way that would sideline him and possibly have him killed. He decided to move first. For months, he assembled a team, secured the support of key capos, and planned the operation with the help of his own underboss, Sammy Gravano. The hit was not sanctioned by the commission, a violation of the rules that Luciano had put in place in 1931. But Gotti calculated that once Castellano was dead, the other families would accept the outcome. On December 16, 1985, at 5:26 in the evening, Castellano's car pulled up outside Sparks Steakhouse on East 46th Street in Midtown Manhattan. 4 gunmen in matching trench coats and fur hats were already in position. As Castellano stepped out of the passenger side, they opened fire. He was struck 6 times and died on the sidewalk. His driver, Thomas Bellotti, was shot dead on the same spot seconds later. Gotti sat in a parked car across the street and watched. 2 weeks later, he was named boss of the Gambino family. He was convicted in 1992 for the murder, among other charges, and died in prison in 2002. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.